And then next we'll proceed to the next presenter. I think whether we have any doubts and clarifications required now, or we'll proceed to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Dr. Prao.
Yeah.
I believe my slides are going to be shared any second. I still don't see them.
Thank you, Saverio. Next presentation. Your presentation on issues declining livestock and eroding animal breeds. Please proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to talk about animal breeds and potential problems with loss of domestic animal diversity, and I will talk especially about breeding systems in a pastoral context. Next slide. Right, if you Google domestic animal diversity, the first hit you get is the Domestic Animal Diversity Information System of the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the FAO. But the platform is a database of country-level information on local breeds as provided by the respective ministries of agriculture. In collaboration with some 150 scientists around the world, the FAO also publishes the State of the World's report on animal genetic resources for food and agriculture. So far, there have been two reports, one in 2007 and one in 2015. And according to the second report, about 17% of known livestock breeds are classified as at risk of extinction. But for about half of the known breeds, there is no sufficient information to assess the risk level. The risk of loss of domestic animal diversity originates mainly from changes in the livestock sector, driven by economic, social, demographic, and political factors. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, thanks. A concern for domestic animal diversity formally entered the international arena in 1946, when the newly created FAO was assigned the task of cataloging, maintaining, and utilizing livestock biodiversity. But since the Industrial Revolution, scientists have been worrying about the erosion of centuries-old environmental fitness in traditional breeds as consequence of the modernization of the livestock sector. Domestic animal diversity was seen as a raw material, difficult to reproduce, and yet potentially a useful base for the incipient practice of scientific breeding. Next. Yes. So far, I have talked of breeds, domestic animal diversity, and animal genetic resources as if the terms were interchangeable. This is indeed how the terms are often used in the debate, but there are significant differences. And these differences become more important as the analysis opens up to a global perspective. What is a breed remains confusedly defined, even amongst the specialists. And at one end of the spectrum are the breeds of registered breeding associations, formally entitled to be called breeds, but that excludes most of the known so-called indigenous breeds, which are either not registered or often not even formally or correctly described. At the opposite end of the spectrum, a breed is anything that the breeders say is a breed, which is very inclusive, but also not terribly helpful. As for biodiversity and genetic diversity, the latter, genetic diversity, is included in the former, but not quite the other way around. Biodiversity goes much beyond the genetic configuration, and in ways that might not be that important in modern animal breeding, but as we will see, are of great importance for pastoral systems. Next. Finally, domestic animal diversity includes both the diversity across livestock breeds and species, and most importantly, also within breed diversity. That is the degree of biodiversity within a given breeding population. You can see within breed diversity as the capacity for change, the variability embedded in the breeding population, and therefore the variability embedded in the production system. The aggregate variance at breed level within breed variation provides the flexibility that breeds need to have in order to respond to changing conditions. Some of the highest levels of within breed diversity are found in pastoral system. Next. But what is pastoralism? This is a very difficult question because the classifications continues to be relatively confused. On about 40% of land on Earth, rainfall is highly unpredictable. For food producers who specialize in, so to speak, being in the right place at the right time, these unpredictable environments offer important opportunities for food production. And pastoralists are this kind of producers. Pastoral systems all over the world, although highly diverse, they all have developed from the same adaptive approach, which consists in operating as an integral part of the natural environment. They manage grazing itineraries, their animals' grazing itineraries, so that the animals feed better than they would without the herder. And they do so at a variety of scales, depending on the level of specialization. And they specialize in making use of highly unpredictable environments. Next. When the functional process or processes in the system can be kept variable enough to match the changes in the environment, the outputs are relatively stable, even in highly variable conditions. In the face of the uncertainty from making use of a highly unpredictable environment, the logic of pastoralism, therefore, is to keep options open. Flexibility of option compensates in their case for lack of certainty. And as we will see, promoting and maintaining high levels of domestic animal diversity in their herds is very much part of this logic. For example, pastoralists typically keep several species of animals in the family herd to match the diversity of opportunities in the environment. Sometimes cattle, camels, sheep, goats, and donkeys. But of course, a breed developed within this horizon is a very different entity than a breed developed in order to maximize a single trait. Livestock breeding in pastoral systems has been largely overlooked. Let's look at one of the handful systems that have been studied, cattle breeding amongst the Peul Boudabe in Niger. Next. The Boudabe are expert cattle keepers. They are all across the Sahel. This particular information comes from Niger, but you find them from Sahel from Senegal to Sudan. In Niger, they keep one of the largest cattle breeds in the African continent, the so-called longhorn Zebu Bororo, or sometimes red Bororo or red Fulani. And this was first formally characterized in 1941. A few weeks ago, a newspaper in the UK, in Great Britain, was launching the alarm that with climate change, the summer temperature in the UK, which barely reached 30 degrees, had become too high for the local cattle. Next. In the natural environment in which the Boudabe operate, temperatures reach 50 degrees in the shade, with precipitations between 0 and 400 millimeters in one rainy season, that stretches over a maximum of 4 months and often is considerably shorter. These natural environments are rich in biodiversity, and cattle can feed, are able to feed on more than 60 varieties of plants, including not only grass, but also bushes and tree leaves. Obviously, most of these plants are seriously defended. They are thorny, some of them are toxic, some of them are toxic at a certain time of the year, but not at others. So feeding on them requires considerable competence on the part of the animals. Watering is done every other day during the largest parts of the dry season, and every second day in the last couple of months when the camp is as far as 30 kilometers from the water point. And cattle are never fenced in, so they need to stay around. They need not to scatter. They need to know what they need to do. And at night, they leave for grazing and return to the camp all by themselves. Rather than being herded from behind, as often happens with ruminants, these animals follow the herder. The herder walks in front of them. There will be a picture in a second to show how it works. And they respond to numerous commands. Now, the rain falls in itinerant showers in most of the rangelands, and it is impossible to predict from one year to the next where pasture will grow. Consequently, nutrients for livestock are distributed unevenly and unpredictably across the range. Next, variability rules. This is true at all scales, both in time and in space. Variations between seasons and between macroecological zones are the most obvious examples at the highest scales. But the concentration of nutrients also changes between plants and between parts of plants. It also changes during the life cycle of the plant, first peaking and then decreasing slowly as the plant uses the nutrients for its own reproduction. And it changes also between day and night, peaking in the evening and after a full day of photosynthesis. The availability of nutrients also expands and contracts, often dramatically at unpredictable intervals between years. So in order to optimize productivity, livestock needs to feed in the right place, but not only, but also at the right time, because feeding at a different time on the same plant will trigger a better or worse intake of nutrients. And in order to be able to feed at the right time and in the right place, and so to speak, just on the right bites, the herd needs a lot of competence. So what contributes to make herds of cattle that can do all this? Next. Cattle reproduction is strictly controlled amongst the Wodabé. Ideally, every mating event is controlled, and the herders will choose the bull, will decide when mating happens, will source the bull from friends because they know it's a good animal, they've seen it before, and so on. So in practice, data from the study of the breeding systems indicate that a competent herder can succeed in controlling mating in over 90% of cases. The animal's genealogy is memorized. Non-productive animals are systematically sold. Networks of breeders borrow reproductive bulls from one another and lend each other cows. Cow lending is institutionalized, lending for years. And the animal remains in the receiving herd for the time of delivering 1 or 2 cows and then is returned pregnant. So there is exchange and circulation also of genetic material, but also of what the animal has learned by remaining in someone else's herd, therefore most likely in other different grazing environments for quite a long stretch of time. Crossbreeding is traditional and is used to when the herders are moving into new territories, not to help the animals to habituate to the new environment. Used to expand the range of production, therefore, and the range of strategies available to the household, and to adapt the herd when moving into new conditions. Next. All animals need to be productive and sufficiently robust to survive the demanding conditions with only minimum input from veterinary services. Within these broad parameters, cattle selective mating by the Wodabe is aimed at increasing diversity within the herd. A major criterion for selection is behavior, especially feeding behavior, but also social behavior within the herd, and including the attachment to humans, to the herders, not to any human. Wodabe herds are complex social organizations, not dissimilar to the herds of wild herbivores, although with some important differences, of course, such as, for example, the low level of internal antagonism, which is reduced and controlled by removing the bulls as soon as they grow beyond a certain age. Antagonism is controlled because antagonism gets in the way, creates stress, and stress gets in the way of not only of good health, as experimentally proved, but also of efficient feeding. But antagonism is also controlled by promoting bonding relationships between the animals. The Wodabe use in their own language the same term that they use for human friendship, and they say, these animals have made friends, they are friends. For example, the way to do this is to attach all the young calves during the night, every night, on both sides of a rope that is stretched across the camp. And they always attach them in the same relative position, so the animals become familiar with one another. And when antagonism or problems happen when they are grown up, they can return to the old friend for help. They are always attached in the same position. The herders explain that this is in order to familiarization, so they are aware of this. There are also very many other examples of promote learned behavior. Next, these are just some. As you can see, is a certain degree of variety. One very much appreciated feature, which is called gaiety, has to do with the attachment to the family. But another one is consists in being able to graze on very short grass, which will give the herd maybe a few days or even a week of advantage at the beginning of the rainy season, when the grass is green and the animals stop eating dry grass, dry hay, but the grass is still very short. So animals that can eat this very short grass without ingesting much sand, they do better. Next. This is an example of a very young grass. Next. As you can see, this is a photo of a young cow who is spending the evening next to the fire with a boy who probably grooms it during the day and detects it. The animals are very familiar with humans. They're very attached. Next. And here you see the herd being led from the front rather than being pushed from behind. So this is about 50 animals, all with very long horns, and the herder doesn't even look at them, just walks slowly and talks to the first one, and everything else follows. Next. I said that they would have a breed for diversity. Now let's have a closer look at this kind of diversity. Wodabe name newborn calves, all newborn calves, whether male or females, after the name of the mothers. This naming system, which is institutionalized, all Wodabe use it, organizes the herd into matrilineal families and allows to track breeding across human generations. The name refers to both the whole lineage and each one of its members. For example, in talking about a cow named Goodell, a herder would say, oh, Goodell was already in the herd of my grandfather when my father was a child. And he looks at the cow, but actually talks about the lineage. Would other breeding goals for the purpose of animal production include both genetic and non-genetic inheritable traits? Breeders have preferred lineages. There are animals they like very much, and they say, well, this is my favorite family of cows. But their presence in the herd is deliberately not maximized, because in the breeder's strategy, herd diversity takes priority. This is a system aimed at embedding variability into the herd, not maximizing some ideal top production or top trait that cannot exist, because you can only have an optimization against a stable context, but the context changes all the time. So what is optimal in the dry season will not be optimal in the rainy season, and so on. So not just genetic resources, but also epigenetic gene expression that complements complex learned behaviors functional to interfacing with the environment. Examples are feeding competence, social organization, knowledge of the territory, attachment to the herders, which I've already mentioned, experience in managing difficult terrains or high temperatures. There are many more examples, and all create animals adapted to the multiple landscapes they inhabit. Mother's influence begins in the womb through flavors of food that she's eaten and that remain in her amniotic fluid, and then continues after birth through flavors of foods in her milk or chemicals that are transferred to the calf as the mother licks it, and then the calf licks itself and takes in. And the mother is a model for what to eat and what not to eat, and where and where not to go for her offspring. Learned behaviors and abilities involve anatomical and physiological changes in organ systems, including the microbiome. Pastoral breeds are constantly in the making. They are not stable or stabilized entities. The very nature is to be constantly in the making. They are developed to interface production with landscapes that are also constantly in the making, and they are defined, therefore, by their variability. The primary objective of breeding here is not to maximize a trait or a set of traits, but towards some optimal animal object with the right combination of genes. The primary objective is to keep high, and as high as possible, the capacity for a given herd to function as a matching interface with a never-changing landscape. Next. An argument, next, I jumped one, sorry. An argument commonly used for promoting the conservation of domestic animal diversity or animal genetic resources is that many livelihood systems depend on it. However, this relationship between domestic animal diversity and animal genetic resources and livelihood systems has been generally assumed to be limited to an evolutionary adaptation to local conditions. This is consistent with the sedentary perspective of the European tradition and with the overarching project of animal science since the Industrial Revolution, which has been aiming at emancipating production from the vagaries of nature. I would like you to dwell for an instant on this point, as externalizing nature in food production has become a critical distinguishing trait in the current call to rethink agricultural systems in the face of climate change. But what about outside this tradition? What if the livestock systems are mobile and therefore the local conditions of production systems are dynamic and greatly diverse, and although natural, they are effectively the result of management? And what if livestock systems specialize in operating in close integration with the natural environment rather than in externalizing it? And therefore, the animal environment interaction is not about coping, but is about benefiting. In those cases, as in the cases of the Bodabe, the common practice of equating domestic animal diversity to animal genetic resources and the narrow focus on adaptation to local conditions would seem to be sufficient to represent the relationship between livestock breeds and the livestock system they support. No, it would not. This equation would not be sufficient. Next. Pastoral systems are often described, and this is my conclusion, pastoral systems are often described as the food production systems most vulnerable to climate change. At the opposite end of the spectrum, resilience to climate change, though, rests on the capacity to shield production from the vagaries of nature by means of high energy inputs and intensive use of resources. The problem with this is that high energy inputs and intensive use of resources to separate production from nature are very much what is raising global average temperature. They are part of the approach that has precipitated climate change and that continues to fuel global warming. Mitigate the effects of climate change by continuing to depend on these measures might work locally on the short term, but only at the cost of remaining on the present trajectory towards a catastrophic runaway climate change. Pastoral systems might not appear so resilient at the moment, but their resilience is resting on working with nature rather than against it. The latest IPCC report predicts that global average temperature will reach plus 1.5 by 2040 in the most optimistic scenario. That is 50% higher than the record in the last 10,000 years. Facing this prospect, there might be more future in the vulnerability of working with nature than in the resilience based on fighting it. In this light, livestock breeding in pastoral systems and the different meaning that gives to domestic animal diversity beyond the current focus on genetic material carry new relevance well beyond pastoralism. Thank you very much. Next and final slide. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Saverio. Sorry for the disturbance. So, Dr. Saverio has explained all aspects of issues related to declining livestock and eroding animal breeds. He has described about the FAO rule during Act reports in 2007 and 2016, and the various reports saying that there is a risk in the livestock. There is a timeline in these various aspects, and domestic animal diversity and biodiversity aspects. And then with breeds and their varieties provides flexible breeding lines and their development, and then domestic animal diversity and pastoralism. And again, he dealt with the breeding systems and the breeding for functional traits and breeding for variability and different lineages with functional skills and normally not genetic diversity, and there's epigenetic variations also affecting the animals. And then pastoral systems in the face of climate change also he explained. So thank you, Dr. Saverio, for your nice presentation. And